The average home in Japan is about 1,100 square feet. That is roughly the size of a two-bedroom apartment in most American cities. The average American home is more than double that, sitting at around 2,200 square feet. That was in 2023. Back in 1949, the average new American home was barely 900 square feet, smaller than what the Japanese are building today. So how did two of the most developed nations on Earth end up with completely opposite ideas about how much space a family actually needs? This story does not start with architecture or interior design. It starts with the ground itself, and with two very different pieces of geography that shaped everything that came after. Japan is an archipelago of nearly 7,000 islands sitting at the edge of the Pacific Ring of Fire. The terrain is volcanic, the slopes are steep. About 73% of the entire country is covered in mountains, dense forests, and land too rugged to build on. Only about 20% of Japan's total land mass is actually flat enough for people to live and work on. That is a sliver. And that narrow band of habitable coastline and valley floor is where more than 125 million people have to fit. Think about that for a second. Take an island chain roughly the size of California, carve away 3/4 of the buildable land, then ask a population nearly 4 times the size of California's to share what is left. Every person in Japan lives within about 112 kilometers of the coast. There is literally nowhere else to go. The math was never going to produce sprawling ranches with 3-car garages. In cities like Tokyo, the density is beyond anything most Americans have ever experienced. The Greater Tokyo metropolitan area packs roughly 37 million people into a stretch of coastal plain called the Kanto. That is more people than the entire nation of Canada, living in a space you could drive across in a couple of hours, and they are not all crammed into high-rises. Millions of those residents live in detached single-family homes. The homes are just small. A typical house in central Tokyo runs about 900 to 1,000 square feet. In some dense neighborhoods, the houses sit less than 2 meters apart from each other, wall to wall, which is some of the tightest detached housing on the planet. And somehow, it works. It works because Japanese domestic culture was never designed around the idea that every room needs one single, permanent purpose. Walk into a traditional Japanese home, a washitsu, and the first thing you notice is what is missing. There is no couch, no dining table, with 6 chairs permanently positioned in the center of a room. No king-sized bed frame taking up half a bedroom. Instead, there are tatami mats on the floor, woven from rice straw and rush grass, each one measuring roughly 3 feet by 6 feet. Rooms in Japan are not measured in square feet or square meters the way Western homes are. They are measured in tatami mats, a 6-mat room, an 8-mat room. The mat is the unit of space, and the mat tells you exactly how much floor you have to work with. This system goes back centuries. During the Muromachi period, starting around 1336, tatami mats shifted from being portable floor coverings used by the wealthy to a standard flooring material installed wall-to-wall. By the time the Edo period arrived in the 1600s, even commoners had tatami floors. And with that change came a fundamentally different relationship between people and their living space. The genius of the system is that one room does everything. During the day, a tatami room is a living space. You sit on flat cushions called zabuton around a low wooden table. You drink tea, you eat meals. You have conversations. At night, you pull a futon out of a built-in closet called an oshier, unroll it onto the tatami, and the living room becomes a bedroom. In the morning, you fold the futon back up, slide it into the closet, and the bedroom is a living room again. No room sitting empty for 16 hours a day, waiting for someone to sleep in it. No formal dining room gathering dust because the family only uses it on holidays. Every square foot is working at all times, and the walls themselves are not really walls at all. Traditional Japanese homes use shoji screens, thin wooden frames covered in translucent washi paper that let diffused sunlight pass through, and fusuma, heavier opaque sliding panels. These screens can be opened to combine 2 small rooms into one larger space for gatherings. or closed to divide a large room into private sections for sleeping. The house is not a set of fixed, permanent boxes. It is a series of flexible zones that reshape themselves depending on what the household needs at any given moment. This was not some trendy, minimalist experiment dreamed up by a design magazine. This was a practical, centuries-old response to a country where buildable land has always been scarce, and where the floor beneath your feet might start shaking without warning. There is an old Japanese aesthetic concept called wabi-sabi. It is difficult to translate precisely, but it points toward finding beauty in impermanence, in things that are incomplete, in objects that wear out and change over time. A cracked tea bowl mended with gold is more beautiful than one that never broke. A weathered wooden beam is more honest than a polished one. That philosophy is baked into the way Japanese homes work. Nothing is meant to last forever, and the culture embraced that idea fully. The other factor is fire. During the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, Tokyo, then called Edo, was the largest city in the world. It was also built almost entirely from wood and paper. Major fires swept through the city with terrifying regularity. The Great Fire of Meireki in 1657 killed an estimated 100,000 people and destroyed roughly half the city. The residents rebuilt. Then another fire came. They rebuilt again. Historians estimate that large sections of Edo burned down and were reconstructed dozens of times over the course of 2.5 centuries. That cycle of destruction and renewal was not a catastrophe the culture endured. It became part of how the culture operated. And then there are the earthquakes. Japan experiences roughly 1,500 earthquakes per year that are strong enough to be felt by people on the surface. The country sits at a junction of 4 major tectonic plates that produces some of the most violent seismic events anywhere on Earth. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 destroyed most of central Tokyo, leveled the port city of Yokohama, and killed more than 100,000 people. The Kobe earthquake of 1995 killed over 6,000. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of 2011 killed nearly 20,000 and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. When the ground can erase your home every few decades, the entire emotional and financial relationship between a person and their house changes. And this is where Japan's housing story takes a turn that most Westerners find genuinely baffling. Japanese homes are, by design, disposable. This was a decision that seemed small at the time. It was not. After World War II, Japan faced a catastrophic housing shortage. American firebombing had flattened entire cities. Tokyo alone lost roughly half its buildings during the war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated by atomic weapons. The government and private developers needed to house millions of displaced families as fast as possible, and they prioritized speed and cost over durability. Millions of small, inexpensive, prefabricated wooden homes went up across the country throughout the 1950s and 60s. They were built fast, they were built cheap, and they were built with the unspoken understanding that they would not need to last forever. That temporary mindset became permanent. Today, the average Japanese home is demolished when it is about 30 years old. The building itself depreciates to nearly zero value within 20 to 30 years. The government's official depreciation schedule pegs the useful life of a wooden house at 22 years. After that, it is worth nothing on paper. When someone moves away or passes on, the house is typically torn down. New buyers purchase the land, not the structure sitting on top of it. The old house becomes a pile of construction debris. The government reinforced this cycle by updating building codes every decade or so to improve earthquake resistance. A major seismic code overhaul in 1981 made most pre-existing homes technically substandard overnight. If your house was built before '81, it did not meet the new standards. Banks would not finance it. Buyers did not want it. Down it came. And there was a cultural precedent for this that ran much deeper than post-war economics. One of the most sacred sites in all of Japan, the East Grand Shrine in Mie Prefecture, has been ceremonially demolished, and rebuilt from scratch every 20 years for more than 1,000 years. The ritual is called Shikinen Sengu. The same design, the same traditional construction methods, the same materials. Tear it down, build it again. The shrine is never old, and it is never new. It is perpetually renewed. In a culture where that kind of cyclical rebuilding carries deep spiritual meaning, tearing down a 30-year-old tract house does not feel wasteful. It feels normal. The timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. Just as the old post-war houses were hitting the end of their expected lifespans in the 80s and 90s, a new generation of Japanese architects started seeing the disposable house not as a limitation, but as a canvas. And that created an unexpected kind of creative freedom. Because a Japanese house never needs to appeal to a future buyer, because the next owner is going to demolish it regardless, homeowners can build whatever they want. Some of the most wildly experimental residential architecture on the planet comes out of Japan for precisely this reason. Houses with no windows on the street side. Concrete cubes with tiny interior courtyards that somehow flood the whole structure with natural light. Buildings shaped like wedges, triangles, and spirals, designed to fit impossibly narrow urban lots. When nobody will ever resell your building, the building becomes a personal statement rather than a marketable commodity. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover history and culture like this every week. Now, enter William Levitt. While Japan was rebuilding small, temporary homes on a crowded volcanic island chain, the United States had the exact opposite problem sitting on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean. Too much empty land and not nearly enough houses. When American soldiers came home from World War II, they came home to a country in the middle of its own housing crisis. Millions of returning veterans and their rapidly growing families had nowhere to live. A Senate committee report from 1947 documented families squeezing into converted garages, chicken coops, coal sheds, and repurposed Quonset huts left over from the military. One Oklahoma newspaper ran a classified ad for a large icebox that, quote, could be fixed up to live in. That was the state of American housing in 1947. William Levitt was a real estate developer from Brooklyn who had built military housing for the Navy during the war. He understood mass production. He understood logistics. And he understood that millions of desperate families with government-backed loan eligibility represented the largest captive housing market in the country's history. He looked at that crisis and saw a business opportunity on a scale nobody had attempted before. In 1947, a potato blight struck Long Island, and 7,000 acres of prime farmland came on the market at bargain prices. Levitt bought the land and started building what would become the most famous suburb in American history. He treated home construction the way Henry Ford had treated car manufacturing. Instead of skilled craftsmen building one house at a time from start to finish, Levitt broke the process into 27 distinct steps and created specialized crews for each one. The crews moved from lot to lot in sequence. One team poured foundations, the next framed walls, another hung drywall, another installed plumbing. At peak production, Levitt & Sons were completing 30 new houses every single day. The homes themselves were modest by any standard, about 750 square feet of living space. A 4-room Cape Cod box on a lot of 6,000 square feet. But the price was something no veteran could argue with. You could buy a Levitt house with zero money down and monthly payments of about $60. The moment Levitt announced the first 2,000 homes were available, 6,000 applications flooded in within days. By 1951, Levittown on Long Island had 17,447 homes and more than 82,000 residents. It was the largest planned residential community ever built in the United States. Everything about Levitt's model was about to reshape how Americans lived. Developers from coast to coast copied his formula. Suburban tract housing spread outward from every major American city throughout the 50s and 60s. But Levittown alone did not explain why American homes kept getting bigger and bigger for the next 7 decades. That took 3 pieces of federal policy working together, each one amplifying the others. The first was the GI Bill of 1944. Officially called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, it gave returning veterans access to low-interest, government-guaranteed mortgages with almost no down payment required. Before the GI Bill, buying a house demanded a massive cash deposit and a short repayment window. After the GI Bill, millions of working-class and middle-class families who never could have qualified for a mortgage suddenly could. The second piece was the Federal Housing Administration, created a decade earlier in 1934. The FHA insured long-term mortgages, which meant banks were willing to lend to borrowers they previously would have turned away. If the borrower defaulted, the government would cover the bank's loss. That single guarantee opened the floodgates for residential lending across the country. And the third piece was the one that physically made the suburbs possible. On June 26, 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law. It authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway, with the federal government covering 90% of the cost. $25 billion for the largest public works project the country had ever seen. Those highways were pitched partly as a Cold War defense measure, a way to evacuate cities in the event of a nuclear attack. But their real impact was suburban. A worker in downtown Manhattan could now live 30 miles out on Long Island and commute on a brand new expressway. A family in inner-city Chicago could buy a house in a subdivision 40 minutes outside the city limits and still make it to the office on time. Highways made distance irrelevant. And when distance stops mattering, the price of land drops. Cheap land, easy mortgages, subsidized roads. That combination did not just encourage Americans to buy houses in the suburbs. It essentially bribed them to do it. You would think someone would have said something, that some urban planner or economist would have raised a hand and asked whether paving over millions of acres of farmland to build enormous single-family homes for every family in the country was a sustainable long-term strategy. Nobody did, or if they did, nobody listened. And then came the baby boom. Between 1946 and 1964, American families averaged 4.6 million babies per year. That is a tidal wave of new humans who all needed bedrooms, bathrooms, and backyards. Builders responded by making houses bigger with every passing decade. What started as a modest Cape Cod in Levittown evolved into the split-level ranch in the 60s, the colonial revival in the 70s, and eventually the suburban McMansion of the 90s and 2000s, those massive, vaguely European-looking houses with double-height foyers, cathedral ceilings, and more bathrooms than bedrooms. By the turn of the century, the number of registered automobiles had jumped from about 26 million in 1945 to well over 200 million. Every family had at least one car. Most had two. And the suburban house needed a garage to hold them. The numbers tell the full story. In 1949, the average new American home was about 909 square feet. By 1970, it had climbed to roughly 1,500. By the mid-2000s, it passed 2,000. And by 2015, the average new single-family home peaked at nearly 2,500 square feet, almost triple what a post-war family had started with. And here is the part that really puts the gap into perspective. While the houses were tripling in size, the families inside them were shrinking. In 1790, the average American household had close to 6 people living under one roof. By 2024, that number had fallen to about 2.5. The houses got 3 times bigger. The families inside them got cut in half. The result is that each American now lives with roughly 714 square feet of personal space. Compare that to Japan, where the figure is closer to 240 square feet per person. An American has about 3 times the indoor living space of a Japanese citizen. Both countries are wealthy, developed, technologically advanced nations. Both have clean water, fast internet, and reliable electricity. The difference comes down to a set of assumptions about what home means. Assumptions that got embedded in law and culture during the middle of the 20th century, and that neither country ever seriously revisited. In America, A home is treated as an investment vehicle. You buy it, you build equity. It appreciates over time. The federal tax code literally rewards you for carrying a mortgage because you can deduct the interest from your income taxes. Bigger homes tend to appreciate faster in most markets, so every financial incentive pushes families toward more square footage. More bedrooms than you need, a formal dining room you never use, a third bathroom because the real estate listing looks better with it. In Japan, the home is closer to a consumable, like a car. You buy it, you use it for a generation, you customize it to your exact tastes, and when you are finished with it, someone tears it down and builds a new one. The land holds its value and often appreciates. The building itself is a depreciating asset from the day the last nail goes in. Neither model is inherently right or wrong, but they produce radically different daily lives. In a typical Japanese household, storage is an art form. Closets are engineered to the centimeter. Seasonal clothing gets rotated out and vacuum sealed. Kitchens are compact, with appliances stacked vertically instead of spread across a granite countertop. The bathing area combines a shower station and a deep soaking tub in a space smaller than most American walk-in closets, and the water is shared by the whole family to conserve resources. The toilet often sits in its own tiny room, separate from the bath entirely. Every corner of the house has a job. In a typical American home, there is a good chance that at least one entire room goes largely unused on any given day. A guest bedroom that hosts visitors twice a year. A finished basement that mostly stores holiday decorations and exercise equipment that nobody touches. A formal living room that exists primarily because the floor plan included one. A recent survey found that Americans spend most of their waking time at home in just 3 rooms: the kitchen, the bedroom, and the living room, even when their house has 7 or 8 rooms to choose from. Both systems are now showing cracks that would have been hard to predict when they were first designed. Japan has a ghost house problem. The country's population peaked around 2010 at about 128 million and has been declining every year since. Birth rates have plummeted to around 1.2 children per woman, well below the replacement level of 2.1. Young people are clustering in major cities like Tokyo and Osaka, while small towns and rural communities are emptying out. Entire neighborhoods of small, aging homes now sit vacant and deteriorating. The government calls them akiya, literally empty houses. Some estimates put the number at over 8 million nationwide. Certain municipalities have started giving these houses away for free, and in a few cases, offering cash subsidies to anyone willing to take one, just to keep the abandoned structures from collapsing onto neighboring properties or becoming fire hazards. Meanwhile, in the United States, the era of the ever-expanding home appears to be quietly winding down. Average new home sizes have been declining since that 2015 peak. Higher mortgage interest rates, surging construction costs, driven partly by lumber tariffs, and an entire generation of buyers priced out of the market their parents grew up in, are all pushing the numbers down. The median new home completed in 2023 measured about 2,156 square feet, well below the peak of a decade earlier. Some American builders are now experimenting with smaller, more flexible housing designs, accessory dwelling units in suburban backyards, micro-apartments in city centers, homes designed around adaptable spaces that serve multiple functions depending on the time of day. If that concept sounds familiar, it should. The Japanese figured out flexible multi-purpose living rooms about 500 years ago, when households during the Muromachi period started covering their floors in tatami and replacing permanent walls with sliding paper screens. And Japan, for its part, is beginning to rethink the scrap and build cycle that has defined its housing market for 7 decades. Younger Japanese workers who cannot afford new construction are discovering that renovating an older home costs a fraction of building from scratch. Companies like Sekisui House have launched remodeling programs designed to extend the lifespan of existing structures far beyond the old 30-year benchmark. For the first time in decades, some Japanese are starting to see older homes not as tear-down candidates, but as renovation opportunities. The idea is straightforward. If you can keep an old house standing and functional, its value does not have to crash to zero. and a generation of workers dealing with stagnant wages gets access to housing they could not otherwise touch. Two countries. Two completely different answers to the same fundamental question. Japan built small because its geography demanded it, because earthquakes made permanence risky, and because a culture of flexible, multi-purpose spaces meant you could live a full life in less room than most Americans would accept for a guest bedroom. The United States built big because a continent's worth of open land allowed it, because the federal government subsidized every piece of the suburban puzzle from mortgages to highways, and because a generation of post-war policymakers decided the detached single-family home was the physical embodiment of American prosperity. The real question is not which country got it right. It is whether either answer still fits a world where Japan's population is shrinking by hundreds of thousands of people per year, and where millions of young Americans cannot afford the kind of house their grandparents bought on a factory worker's salary. If this topic interested you, the video on screen right now goes deeper into how geography shapes the way entire civilizations organize their lives. Click it.